Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be talking about Turkey's Ottoman dreams, something that honestly, as folks in the West, people who are expats in Turkey, like for a long time, we kind of laughed a little bit about, but it just sort of hit me personally. It sort of struck me personally over the past week that these dreams are looking a little more real recently. Basically, I'm going to spend the next half hour to an hour talking about that and sort of how that's impacting my thinking, how that should impact a lot of folks' thinking, and also actually the sort of lessons that this teaches going forward for the United States, for folks who are worried about the rise of China, for the folks who are worried about a multipolar world. I think it's very interesting stuff. Before we get into it, we've got some preliminaries. Let me just figure out. Okay, I think I've got things pretty much handled here on my end administratively. So here, if you're new here, what we do is I speak for about a half hour, 45 minutes on whatever the topic is, maybe a little longer, maybe even a little shorter. And then we do Q&A. You'll notice to the right of your screen, there is a live chat, folks chatting, talking about the topics here, other things, what have you. You are encouraged to engage with that heavily. You are welcome to criticize me, my quarantine beard, what have you. Go in on me and what I'm saying as much as you want. We have a pretty aggressive sort of free speech policy here. You just do what you want. What you can't do is attack other people or act to actively disrupt the chat. Like if you're just gonna, start spamming it or going after other commenters for things that they say or their ethnicity or something like that, that is not allowed. Logo Cool Extreme has kindly volunteered once again to moderate this conversation. If you're getting off the path, Logo will tell you, he'll warn you, and then if you continue to act that way, he will block you. So Logo has that power. Let him listen to him. But yeah, generally, say what you want about me, say what you want about what I'm saying, just don't attack each other. That is the golden rule of these chats. And also don't actively try to disrupt the chat. I don't have the mental bandwidth to follow what's going on in the chat as I'm talking. I'm working through my outline. So if you have questions, of course, ask them now. But then once the Q&A starts, then ask me again, because I won't see the question now as I'm sort of bloviating. Also, one other thing, next week, I'm going to try out something different. I'm going to do another live chat, but it's going to be for patrons only. So if you do enjoy this chat today and you want to get another one, I'm going to keep doing these free for everyone monthly live chats for sure. But next Friday, I think I'm going to try out a patron only chat. If that works out, I'll probably continue to do those going forward. So each month there'll be a live chat that's for everyone and then a live chat for patrons. It's an experiment next week. We're trying it out. Okay, so let's talk about Turkish foreign policy. This is something that's sort of, low-key thing that's just sort of been happening over the past, really it's been happening in some ways since 2011, in some ways since 2002. But it is a sort of shift in focus in both the way that Turkey sees the world internally and the way that it relates with the rest of the world. Specifically with the way that it's worked out thus far is usually with parts of the world that used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. For those of you who don't know, the Republic of Turkey is a successor state to the Ottoman Empire, one of the world's most successful empires that ruled the Middle East and a significant chunk, depending on how you measure it, like half of Europe as well. Between, more or less, it had a growth phase and then a peak phase and then a decline phase. But at its height, it controlled, a lot of Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, up through Hungary, the Balkans, of course, Greece. In Europe, all of what we sort of see as the center of the Middle East today, bumping up against the Safavids in Iran, sort of trading back, parts of modern Iraq, and then all the way around to Algeria in North Africa. And crucially, this is something that's hard for, I think, a lot of European people to, or Western focused people to sort of fit into their mental model. It also, with provisos, extended down to Sudan and Yemen. They had an involved policy sort of in the Indian Ocean, involved foreign policy in the Indian Ocean at some periods. It was a truly global, at least 3-continent empire, tremendous thing. And it went through a very long period of decline. There were certain things around industrialization, nationalism, what have you, things that happened in Europe that spilled over to the Ottoman Empire, which was very much, when I finally do my series on Turkey, I'm going to be talking, one of the main themes is going to be how very European the Ottoman Empire always was. But they got spillover of these factors like industrialization, nationalism, that made that frankly the Ottomans weren't ready to deal with. And for really centuries. I mean, I always mix up the number with the Glorious Revolution in England. It's not 1689, but it was like 1683, I think, was the last Ottoman siege of Vienna. And pretty much from that point, with some exceptions, the Ottomans went from being the sort of terrifying, big bads of European history, or big goods, the superstate that everybody was terrified of, to by the early 20th century, quite very much in disarray and decay. So what's interesting is sort of the Turkish relationship to this Ottoman legacy was very ambivalent for a very long time. It was straightforwardly negative for a very long time. Which is understandable, because in very real sense, the Ottoman Empire failed and was failing, and the sort of leading lights, the founders of the Turkish Republic, had through their lived experience seen the Ottoman Empire fail. So it was this strongly negative view of the Ottoman Empire that was, set for them. Now it's key to point out, like, it was anti-Ottoman, but it was strongly nationalist. These founders of the Turkish Republic were keenly aware of what nationalism had done to the Ottoman Empire, as each of the Balkan republics, each of the Balkan peoples or nations, from Greece through Serbia and on, adapted this sort of mental technology of nationalism and turned it against the Ottomans. And then finally, during World War I, when the Arabs did so as well, they were keenly aware of how powerful a tool nationalism was. So Turkey at its founding was very strongly nationalist, but anti-Ottoman because of that experience of failure. The AK Party that came to power in 2002, I always screw this up in my mind because the party came to power in 2002, but then Erdogan, because of, I think he'd been in jail or something, he couldn't actually serve as prime minister until, was it 2004? But anyway, so the AK Party came to power, and in many, many senses presented a very different front. And of course, the AK Party isn't something that just sort of came out of the blue in 2002. It's something that had a very long and serious history as legacy. The AK Party was relatively new, but the intellectual legacy of the AK Party goes way, way back. It goes back through Erbakan, Necmettin Erbakan. I'm sure I mispronounced that. I apologize. And his welfare party, is that the Rifat party? Anyway, but that was sort of a movement that had been gaining power. You can make arguments that powerful elected politicians in Turkey, going back to the 1950s, had elements of the mental makeup and the approach that sort of makes the current AK Party, going down to Adnan Menderes. I guess he was killed in a coup in the 60s, or was it the late 50s? Apologies, I should have researched this better. Turgut Özal in the 80s. They all sort of played with this idea of I'm not sure Menderes and Özal were as explicitly Ottoman in their approach, but they were more interested in the Islamic legacy, and certainly Erbakan. That was sort of the thing, a sort of more modern approach to Islam and trying to bring it into government. I don't want to give the whole history of Turkish politics here. What I was trying to say is that there was always a fight against the overarching idea that Ottomans were bad and embarrassing. There was an undercurrent of folks who did not agree with that, and you can argue that at some points that was that was actually more democratically representative of the Turkish people. This idea that actually, maybe not everything about the Ottoman legacy is so bad. And honestly, as far as those of you know, I am not an Erdogan fan. I was until I got tear gas a lot back in 2013. But there are aspects of that I think are appropriate. It is appropriate for the AK Party to rediscover, for the Turkish people to rediscover this Ottoman legacy and how it's just an extraordinarily powerful and influential entity in the development of the human species, quite frankly. And I think this idea that Turks, were supposed to be embarrassed of this extraordinary legacy is, I think it made sense, and you can understand why. Like I said, the folks who founded the Turkish Republic had just spent their entire lives dealing with the failure of the Ottoman idea, so you can understand their anger. But I do think the AK Party is right in that there should be more respect and more interest in that era. Of course, what the AK Party is doing is not necessarily reflective of respect and knowledge of the history of the Ottoman Empire. There's what's really interesting about it is, as I'll get into in just a second, the way that it's sort of always worked in their thinking is that it's been kind of like, we're going to reassert this connection with Islam and with the Middle East, and we're going to stop trying so damn hard to be so European. And what's kind of interesting is that Arabic focus, that focus in Arabia, was actually a dynamic. Most heavily used dynamic in the failing centuries of the Ottoman Empire. It was a European empire for a very long time. Of course, nowhere near as much attention is focused on all the genocides that took place against Turkish and Muslim folks in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. But I mean, we have to remember that the Ottoman Empire was a European-focused empire. With also, of course, deep Islamic Middle East elements. But so that sort of bugs me a bit about the AK Party's approach to things. So for a very long time, Turkey was a bit of a basket case. There was obviously extraordinary economic development, progress, what have you, in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, really in every decade of Turkey's existence. But there was a lot of sort of, get to a certain point and crash down, get to a certain point, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back for quite some time. A number of factors and a lot of work that folks had done throughout the history of the Turkish Republic up until 2002 started to come to fruition under the AK Party, and also through initial actions that the AK Party took. Initially, to some extent, even today, or at least 5 years ago when I was in Turkey, the AK Party was seen as, and fairly seen as, less corrupt than the folks that had directly preceded them. So Turkey in 2000, especially after a financial crisis, which I believe was 2000 or 2001, was the last big Turkish banking crisis. And the AK Party, of course, was swept into power in the aftermath of that crisis. So they had a sort of more of a blank slate to work with. And the reforms that were put in place sort of came on stream with like a bunch of other developments, like the Turkish, I think the Turks joined a customs union with the EU in, I think, 96, which, had a ton of positive effects. There was the reform and modernization of the banking industry, had all these positive effects. And generally, before 2008, that was a really good decade economically for most of the world. And the AK Party was there to take advantage of it. So the sort of switch with the AK Party was that they wanted more respect for Ottoman ideas, and they also had more leeway to, they could do more, frankly, than earlier governments were able to do, because they had more financial resources, because Turkey was doing so well. And honestly, in that first decade of AK Party approach, I think there was a lot of great stuff going on. Ahmet Davutoglu, I'm sorry, I cannot, Davutoglu, in my head, I just go Davutoglu, which is inappropriate, and I apologize. He was an advisor for Erdogan between 2003 and 2009 and was the Minister of Foreign Affairs between 2009 and 2014. And he's credited with the zero problems with neighbors strategy, which was frankly fantastic. But there was an Ottoman underpinning to that. That was a really positive, I think, aspect to this Ottoman dreams. You know, it was the this idea that and though that was certainly probably more focused towards the Middle East and sort of, you know, getting closer to Arabic countries again, it was also very focused on Eastern Europe. That was the beauty of the policy. It was zero problems with all neighbors. And I think the Ottoman idea that played in there was that Turkey ought to be a leader in the region. Under the previous dispensation, sort of pre-AK Party, all the wide variety, I'm oversimplifying things to sort of say that, well, there was pre-AK Party and post-AK Party, because, you know, both of these ideas, these sort of, you know, a more religious approach, a more secular approach, a more, there's so much more wrapped up in that, and I don't want to lather for an hour, but I don't want to make it seem like it was, you know, completely different before the AK Party, completely different after the AK Party, but there were, you know, significant changes. So yes, this Ottoman idea that the Ottomans should be leaders in that the Turks should be leaders in the region, both for the Middle East, both for, you know, and for Eastern Europe, and be sort of positive. And that came with a willingness to make some real sacrifices on ideas that would have that actively pissed off a lot of people in Turkey. So the thing about the sort of initial Turkish republic's hyper-nationalism is it was very defensive, quite rightly, as the whole entire Ottoman Empire had been ripped away from them, and just sort of very angry about everything. You know, the MHP, the Milliyet, anyway, I'm not even going to try. The nationalist party in Turkey is just, and still today, unfortunately, now completely in line with the AK Party in a lot of ways. You know, was this sort of hyper-nationalist influence in Turkish politics going back to the 60s, and they weren't interested in giving an inch to anybody. What Erdogan and Davutoglu, I suppose Davutoglu, the Kurds were not Davutoglu's portfolio, but what the AK Party folks were willing to do was initially to make sacrifices of these, you know, hyper-nationalist knee-jerk horseshit in order to take a bigger role in leadership. The AK Party made serious, and Erdogan made serious efforts to build bridges with Armenians. I think Armenia, the actual country of Armenia, probably would have been willing to let that happen. Was probably eager for that to happen. But then the Armenian diaspora, which is much more wealthy in the country of Armenia, was not willing to let that happen. But it was very important and inspiring and great to see a Turkish government making at least the overtures to the Armenians. And they made overtures to Greece. They made to Greece. The growing wealth that they had meant that they had the ability to, you know, in our mind, we sort of think things just sort of get poorer the further you go east. But actually, Istanbul, and certainly the areas around Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, the whole west of Turkey, significantly more wealthy than most of Eastern Europe. Still the case, actually. Yeah, neither Eastern Europe nor Turkey has had a particularly great 5 years. Significantly more wealthy, and was able to use that wealth to do things like build airports and infrastructure throughout Eastern Europe. The sort of soft power of Turkey in this decade really just grew immensely. And I think while there are plenty of folks who'd love to cast sinister aspersions on that, I'm certainly not the person to do it. I think Turkey's influence, I mean, one of the reasons I was so excited about Turkey when I moved there was because of this influence. I thought it was fascinating. It was this amazing synthesis that was being developed. Unfortunately, things got a little harder, and this is sort of the switch. So yes, I was always a supporter. I was always interested in this Turkey taking a larger role on the stage, but in sort of pop culture, and as an expat, I lived in Turkey for 6 years. It was interesting to observe this sort of hyper nationalist Turkish approach to things, and also this sort of new appreciation for religious stuff, and it's sort of all dovetail in weird ways culturally. So certainly as an expat there, I was used to looking at this whole Ottoman dream thing that Turkey had as kind of silly, as kind of goofy, and to some extent it still is. I mean, the stuff that I'm going to run through, while it is much more impressive than I used to think of it. I mean, it's not, this is not the rebirth of the Ottoman Empire here, but it is a very serious, very serious. I would argue actually probably a much more serious imperial policy than the one that, I mean, that's a terrible word, but for lack of a better word, much more serious, much more active foreign policy than Russia is running, frankly. But it's really something that I'm only really putting that together like over the past couple months in my head, because part of that I'd always sort of seen the Ottoman dreams, the focus on Ottoman dreams as just being kind of goofy. There was this film that came out while I was there. It was 1453, which is a dramatization of the Turkish conquest of Istanbul, then Constantinople, in 1453. And it was widely laughed at. Like, we would, as expats, we'd go and see it as like kind of a joke, because in the United States for a very long time, we've, generally speaking, like, I mean, even since the 60s, the cowboys and Indians, like the Native Americans, were more portrayed as sort of, more noble, and what a tragedy that we did this to them. And with the exception of like the Nazis, like, we don't generally have like this, stereotypical, well, and then unfortunately also Arab terrorists, but like we don't have this stereotyped bad guy. And what's great about 1453 is that the Greeks, that the Turks, they're just these evil, like scheming, like, just absolute insane caricatures. So we so used to sort of laugh at that sort of instinct. I'm not really laughing now. I do think that this has developed into something harder, and I don't know. I'm hesitant to say worse for some reason, because I honestly think that many, with the exception of Syria, which I think is getting bad in ways that are it has serious potential problems, both for Turkey and the world. I don't necessarily see these developments as negative, but Turkey has gone beyond the sort of zero problems with neighbors approach, to actually beginning to step out and conquer neighbors again, or not conquer, that's not the right word, and become more seriously involved with neighbors in ways that only really the US, China, or to a lesser extent Russia, are capable of being. France, it's sort of, Turkey has legitimately stepped into like the ranks of the great powers in its involvement in other countries. And that's interesting. You go from like the sort of Republic era from Ataturk in this, 70, I guess 80 years down to the AK Party, you had many problems with all the neighbors with hyper-nationalism. And then you have the first decade of AK, which is, zero problems with neighbors. And now we're getting actual military involvement with neighbors and further beyond. Which is, it's kind of fascinating. I think at this point I should probably run through these things. So Turkish involvement in Africa has been fascinating. It's sort of an intervening step, or actually part of the zero problems with neighbors step, that sort of was the preliminary. And this is very key when we're sort of thinking about China and China's growing involvement in the world. The preliminary step that got them to this, step of actually going out and, having military presence in neighbors. The first step was investment. That may sound a little hawkish, and, oh gosh, we got to be worried about Chinese investment in Africa, which is not the point that I'm finally going to make. But it was very heavy investment. Turkey, from the 80s, this actually goes back to before the AK Party. It was a process of growing, and I think exponential growth. was much more wealthy and was much more able to invest in other places. Turkish business was very important in actually the post-Soviet Union. Very important in Africa, hugely important in Africa. Turkey's been building schools across Africa for decades. Interestingly, a lot of that was kind of FETO, kind of related to Gulen. I would love to read some good reporting on how that all shook out, because the Gulenists, the folks who contributed greatly to Erdogan's rise and then had a massive falling out with Erdogan, were very involved in Africa, in sort of Turkey's Africa soft power. So it'd be kind of interesting to see how that's all shaken out. Would love to read some reporting on that. But Turkish businessmen, Turkish philanthropists, Turkish everything in this period of, say, 2002, 2010, were becoming vastly more involved in the world, building things, building infrastructure everywhere. The Turks provided this nice sort of cultural in-between spot where they had a lot of, oh God, it's hard to talk about this without sounding terribly bigoted, but the sort of Turks were sort of this nice in-between spot where they did have sort of Western or European levels of technical skill and organization, yet also, which for many, many, many reasons, financial, cultural, historical, were lacking in a lot of the Middle East, Northern Africa, what have you. But the Turks also had that Islamic aspect to their culture that allowed them to more easily work in these places. Arguably, allegedly, a more relaxed or understanding approach to the corruption or whatever was necessary to do business in these countries. So Turks were all over before their soldiers were all over. Their businessmen were all over. They were building infrastructure everywhere. The most recent, well, let's talk about Africa more generally. So in Somalia, this is something a bit of the sort of Ottoman dream, sort of Turkish, I can't say Turkish hard power extension that I think is a little blown out of proportion. In Somalia, Turkish businesses are involved in infrastructure to an extent, and they're also training soldiers. So to actually be training soldiers. That's most of what U.S. Special Forces do abroad. We imagine U.S. Special Forces running around assassinating people and whatnot. They do too much of that. But it's a very key part of U.S. empire is the fact that we've got special forces all over Africa, all over everywhere, training people. And now Turkey is doing that in Somalia. That is a big thing. Turkey does have a very involved, serious military. It's funny. I remember seeing a group of military recruits touring around Turkey with a U.S. Marine, and he was not very impressed with the Turkish military's sort of sense of discipline. But they were raw recruits, so perhaps that's unfair. But regardless, it's a very serious military that is training soldiers in Somalia. That is a step. I think this is a little blown out of proportion when people in Washington, D.C. are fear-mongering over this, the expanding Turkish empire or whatever. They tend to really focus on what's going on in West Africa and Somalia and aspirations that Turkey might have in Sudan as well. And I think it's really quite blown out of proportion. I think Turkey has a lot of really positive influence in Africa. Same with China, and that sort of thing should be endorsed, not like panicked about. Qatar is a fascinating one. There are 5,000 Turkish troops stationed in Qatar, and they have been there, I think, since 2016 or 2017. That's huge. That's a traditional. One of the main signposts, the most symbolic things in the switch from the British world system to the U.S. world system in the 60s and 70s was when the relationships in the Gulf, those sort of Gulf monarchies that are so absurdly rich and so important to the petrochemical industries, when those relationships were just sort of transferred from the British to the Americans. So it's a very big deal that there are 5,000 Turkish troops in the Persian Gulf, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, that is serious, like no joke, military power play. That is a huge deal. And the Turkish-Qatari relationship, to some extent, is very important. Just was reading news this week. The Qataris, extended a swap line to Turkey. I'm not going to go in detail on what exactly that means because I haven't read about it this week. And if I don't read about it this week, finance just falls right out of my head. But the Turkish economy has serious problems right now, and the Qataris are helping them stay afloat. And Qatar is a good Gulf monarchy to be friends with because it's got, I think, the balance of financial resources are much better. There's sort of a grim financial picture emerging, certainly for Saudi Arabia, but even Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, those are places that are in serious trouble. But even the UAE and Kuwait are places that are in trouble. Qatar probably has the best finances. That's the right Gulf monarchy to be in with well, and Turkey is. I mean, that's just that 5,000 troops. I mean, that's when you think of the old days of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, so much of their control of places like Yemen were just a garrison that sort of tried to hold on. Yemen was in two separate eras of the Ottoman Empire. It was this just really bruising place. There's really moving Turkish folk songs about that everybody that surprisingly many people know about the horror of sending your son to Yemen who never came back. So like just having 5,000 troops to be happily welcomed in the Persian Gulf. And have a serious role in geopolitics there. I mean, like that's in some ways that's better than what the Ottoman Empire had. So that's very serious. That's very real. Libya is the one that's really gotten me thinking about this recently. Libya is, of course, a disaster created by the United States. In recent last year, Haftar. This is. The United States got involved in Libya to keep Gaddafi from destroying Benghazi. Haftar is the guy who actually destroyed Benghazi. He's a wannabe strongman, and he, in the spring of last year, just over a year ago, attacked Tripoli, which is the seat of the internationally approved, internationally recognized government of Libya. Now, that's as ever, that's a little misleading because while it looks like Haftar has taken over all of Libya, and there's just this small pocket of non-Haftar, I think that's still the majority of the population in that little pocket. Libya is one of these countries, much like Yemen or Syria, that's got a lot of desert in it. So anyway, so Haftar attacked the Haftar attacked last year. And it really, with the support of Russia, France, the UAE, fucking Donald Trump, even though the US State Department's official position is that we support the UN-backed government in Tripoli, Trump was like, oh yeah, Haftar can go do that. It'll be great. Turkey completely, over just the past 3 months, has sort of completely, well, to be clear, Haftar had oversold his chances, and what he'd expected to be a quick takeover of Tripoli was a year-long slog, and then he got some Russian mercenaries in there to help him, and it looked like it was turning against the UN-approved government. And then Turkey just sort of jumped in with both feet. There are Turkish military advisors on the ground. I don't know how much fighting they're doing, but there are drones, there are ships, and most importantly, there are Syrian mercenaries, and they are turning the tide. Just on Monday, the 18th, the Watia air base, which was the center of Haftar's push into Tripoli, was taken back by, and presumably by heavily Turkish-aided forces. I think this is unreservedly a good thing. I think Haftar is a punk, and the most frustrating thing about Haftar was that there was a peace process. There was, real talks between the differing sides in Libya, and Haftar used those to launch an attack 2 or 3 months ago. You could make a serious argument a year ago that actually the House of Representatives government, that's the the government that Haftar was supposedly working for. You could make an argument. I'm not sure it'd be a good argument, but you could make an argument that they were more legitimate. They were elected after the folks who make up the base of the GNA, the UN approved government. But in the past couple of months, Haftar has completely cut out the House of Representatives and is now ruling by emergency decree. He's just a new dictator. I strongly dislike Haftar, and I think that Turkey's efforts in Libya are a good thing. I think they have a serious chance of boomeranging back on Turkey, on the Libyans. If we weren't going through this incredible oil price crisis, then who knows? Maybe all of Haftar's petrostate backers, Russia, UAE, Saudi Arabia, would have been willing to pour in enough money to push this back and step up Libya into a much worse civil war. But as of now, it seems to be working. So that's good. That is a positive thing. You even had something you almost never see in the Western press. You had articles saying Erdogan's gamble pays off. That seems to be working out. And of course, the biggest example of sort of new Ottoman dreams, new Ottoman approach is Syria. And this is one I am not happy with. I've got a whole series on Syria on this channel. But my position on that is that the United States destroyed that country. I got a number of videos I can point you to. This myth that we didn't do enough is absurd. We opened a vast open space in the north of Syria that was filled by jihadists and ISIS and a whole bunch of other folks. And Turkey was completely on board with us with that, which is, I think, quite tragic. What's interesting about both Syria and Libya, well, Syria, Libya, Qatar, is that Turkey was willing to commit in ways that the United States was not. Turkey was willing to put boots on the ground in Syria. And it's interesting because there's so much talk about how Russia's won Syria. Russia did some bombing. Russia's got a lot of mercenaries on the ground. But Turkey has taken over large swaths of territory in Syria. I have a problem with that because I think the reason that there is a conflict in Syria is because the U.S. and Turkey created it. I think that it's a problem because we really don't want to go back to the world where people are annexing territory. To be clear, Turkey has not said that they are annexing territory in Syria. But you look at it and you're like, how does this resolve? It's difficult. It's very difficult to see. There was recently some heavy fighting over over Idlib. You can see how those are similar in Syria, the Idlib province in Syria. And what's interesting is the way that it worked. There had been this pocket in the north of Syria that essentially, the United States paid for a bunch of jihadis to take in 2015. And now it's completely obvious. Everybody knows that it's Al-Qaeda. And it's hilarious. Like the Western press is trying desperately to say, oh, that was Turkey's fault. Yeah, it's Turkey that put Al-Qaeda in charge of Idlib. And that's horseshit, because if you look at articles from 2015, it's, oh, look at our moderate rebels took over Idlib, yada, yada. So what's interesting, the most recent conflict, I do feel bad. I probably should have done a produced video on that, was the way that it made this sort of weird Al-Qaeda pocket that Turkey was sort of half committed to protecting. It sort of cut it down dramatically. The Syrian government sort of took a whole bunch of it, and then they killed a bunch of Turkish soldiers who were on the ground there. And then the Turks took the full weight of a modern military and just fucking obliterated the Syrian army to a point. They just rolled back a whole bunch of what the Syrians had, so laboriously taken, slaughtered a whole bunch. And it was interesting because there was a couple days there. It was like, holy fuck, Turkey's just going to take over Syria. But that's not what happened, because thankfully in our modern world, even Turkey acknowledges that would be more trouble than it's worth. They don't want to take over Aleppo. What a nightmare. They don't want to. But What Turkey has done is they have carved out, the sort of Idlib Al-Qaeda pocket is less and less independent from a Turkish protectorate. I mean, and I think sooner or later, the Turks don't really like Al-Qaeda. That's more the U.S.'s thing. I think sooner or later those folks will get pushed out, slaughtered, or sent to Libya to die. But it's kind of interesting that what's now happened in Syria and will be something that's much longer lasting, I'm afraid, is you've got Turkish troops across borders from Syrian and Russian troops. And that's something that's not good. That's a real physical empire being built again. And that's not no bueno. I'm not sure if I'm articulating this well enough, but I feel that that's a real problem. The Turkish government has been able to leverage legitimate Turkish concerns about the refugees that they've taken in. They've taken in more refugees than anybody else in the world by far, I think 3 or 4 million. To say, oh, we've got to set up this buffer zone to repopulate with these Syrian refugees. Of course, like, why would any Syrian refugee want to leave Istanbul to go to this fucking nightmare zone? But yeah, I mean, you look at Syria, and I spent a lot of time studying the British Empire, sort of studying, how it looks when people take land from other people. How that plays out, and Jesus, I mean, that's what we've got. That's what we've got in Syria, except it's like hyper modern. And the Turks are doing it. I mean, it's if you're looking for like what would real like 19th century style imperialism look like in the 20th century, in the 21st century, like that's the closest analogy I can see is what Turkey's doing in Syria right now, and it's kind of grim. But of course, on the other hand, the Assad has proven that he's not capable of accepting refugees back in large numbers. Also because we're sanctioning him, but that's a whole chain of also buts I don't want to get into. So yeah, I mean, there are justifications for what Turkey is doing. We're not going to get into the Kurd thing. I think the U.S. government definitely betrayed the Turks vastly more than they betrayed the Kurds. I've got a video on that. But so yeah, Syria, not great. So like looking at this, like stepping back in the big picture, it's real. I mean, this is if you were to rank countries that are, great powers that are mucking about with other people's lands and countries in an imperial sense, like you've got United States number 1 with a bullet by far, 100%. Number 2, Russia, yeah. Number 3, gosh, I'd probably say Saudi Arabia, but that's actually something that's fading away, and it's more of a soft power thing, and it's mild. So you got 1, United States, 2, Russia. Number 3, Turkey. Number 4, China. Yeah, I mean, it's real. By and large, however, I don't think, with the exception of Syria, like I don't see how this influence has been negative. To be clear, like, yeah, they're not rebuilding the Ottoman Empire. That's not something that was ever going to happen. But the fact that Turkey has gone this far is, I think, surprising to me. And it's doing things that I think any sensible person would have hoped that countries wouldn't be doing in the 21st century. The question is asking those, why though? Why is this happening? And what's fascinating in all of these instances that I mentioned, Somalia, obviously, Libya, Syria, Qatar, Turkey is stepping up. I think in some senses really is stepping up in a way that maybe somebody should have. But is also, you can look at it in the positive and a negative sense. In Libya, is Turkey is stepping up, or is Turkey taking advantage of a situation to get its dirty paws into it? The way that Washington, D.C. seems to look at it. But like, why do these situations exist? Why is this happening? Why in Somalia, Qatar, Syria, Libya? And the answer in every single one of these instances is because the U.S. fucked up. Because the U.S. thought it was more important for U.S. interests for there to be a disaster in one of these countries. So like the whole Turkish Ottoman dreams, Turkish imperial approach, what have you, would be I would say completely positive and would be completely remaining in the realm of, building infrastructure in Africa and airports in Kosovo and building schools and trying to build business links. I mean, God, like what's so sad is you look at 2010 and like Turkey was trying to form a common market between Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, like Jordan as well. Like it was amazing. It was like, holy cow! Like the Middle East finally like emerging real like economy. Like it's amazing. Of course, what happened was the United States and Turkey decided to destroy Syria, and that ended. So you have to understand, like this, whether you see it as positively or negatively, the fact that Turkey is taking these great power, like military involvement steps. Every single one of these is because the U.S. fucked something up. Somalia, this is something that's barely covered. It's sort of one of the Bush administration's lesser known fuck ups. There was the Islamic courts or something like that were taking over Somalia. They were strongly Islamic, but they really couldn't care less about the rest of the world. But Bush and the Bush administration didn't like it, so we took them out, and then in the aftermath, Al Shabaab emerged, which is a like real deal jihadi terror everywhere kind of place. So we sort of we ruined Somalia. Not that Turkey's really that involved in it. Qatar, the Turkish presence in Qatar, which is like I think like an instance where Turkey beats the Ottomans in like the Empire game. That Turkish military presence is a direct result of Donald Trump and his administration not being able to keep the fucking Saudis in line. Back in, I believe it was 2017, got 2016 written here for some reason. Back in 2017, Saudi Arabia, largely over Al Jazeera, decided to try to isolate Qatar and even threatened invasion of Qatar, which is something that no sane U.S. presidential administration would have ever allowed a Saudi client to do. There's a fucking U.S. military base in Qatar, and Saudi Arabia was credibly threatening invasion. And Donald Trump, fucking speak loudly and carry a limp dick Donald Trump, was letting this happen. Extraordinarily embarrassing. I think the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, was, trying desperately to make it not happen. He's now been replaced by a corrupt thug named Mike Pompeo. But that's the reason Turkish troops are in Qatar. It's because the U.S. fucked up, didn't pay attention. Libya, that's obvious. Libya is a nightmare zone and has been since 2011 when the United States chose to destroy it. To keep Gaddafi from destroying Benghazi. And now elements of the Trump administration are supporting Haftar, who did destroy Benghazi. And Syria. I've got a very long series documenting all the ways that the United States destroyed Syria. So yeah, like the whole basis of this sort of growing Turkish empire that some people in Washington D.C. want us to flip out about is the United States destroying countries. That's it. That's why this happened. That's why, and I think that's a really key influence, that really key insight that Washington D.C. has got to internalize. If you don't want other countries stepping up or acting out in the stage on this way, stop fucking destroying countries. Seriously, I mean, like it just makes sense. This is another aspect of what I keep talking about. There is nothing worse for the country on top than war, and these are all places where, in differing ways, the United States chose war And now you can not too credibly, but you can begin to think about these places as being part of a growing Ottoman Empire because of U.S. irresponsibility, first and foremost. And it's interesting to sort of thinking about China and Chinese influence. And the if I think that a lot of this assumption that China is, going to jump into proxy warring the way the United States does, and like going to jump into destroying countries the way the United States does, so much is like I think a lot of that's overblown. I think that Chinese investment has done extraordinary good all over the world, but it is interesting to think about the way that Turkey did business first, and then once the U.S. destroyed a bunch of countries, got into like physical soldier-born imperializing. So if in truth, if China really is going to start competing with the United States in a new Cold War, this sort of proxy competition, et cetera, if that's really going to happen, the Turkish example makes it seem that the only way it's going to happen is if the United States keeps trying to destroy places. Venezuela is a great example. The Trump administration is currently trying desperately to destroy that country. And that has provided openings for both the Russians and the Chinese. Like the Russians and the Chinese aren't there because everything's going fucking great in Venezuela. They're there because the United States, going back to an attempted coup against Chavez back in 2004, has been actively trying to destroy that place. It's one of the sad stories, I think, from a U.S. perspective, and I am very much so, as I think is probably clear from this talk. I am a U.S. patriot and very interested in the continuance and sane and sustainable continuation of the U.S. world system. I guess from that extent, a positive thing, but from the perspective of Venezuelans, a sort of horrifying thing is that the Venezuelan oil industry has been so mismanaged and is just so impracticable in the modern day that Rosneft, the Russian oil company that was investing in Venezuela, sold all its shares to the Russian government because there's no more money to be made there. It's quite sad. Anyway, I'm falling off, but what I'm saying is like for the perspective of China, if like the new Cold War were something that was actually going to happen, I think this is how it's going to happen. The United States will decide to fucking intervene or fuck around or destabilize some other fucking place, the way we did Libya, Syria, Iraq, obviously, the way we're trying to do with Venezuela. And it's the destruction of countries and their aspirations that provides the opening for military adventuring by other countries. It's the United States that does this to its fucking self. It's not some fiendish plot. It's an open path that is provided to our rivals by U.S. stupidity and U.S. destruction of countries. So it'd be good if we stopped doing that. I hope you enjoyed this summing up of Turkey's Ottoman dreams. We've got 156 people watching, and I'm delighted. That's fantastic. So now it's time to move on to Q&A. Who's got questions? Who's got questions? I would say that I am definitely going to read your question if it comes with a super chat. But I will answer other questions as well. So, all right, questions. Mohammed, you are already being ruled by despots. Are you blind? Well, okay, that's interesting. So there's an argument going on. Multimeyer asks, have you seen the video about Turkey from Kraut? I have not. Is Kraut the one that does those like hour and a half long YouTube videos? I can't, as I'm delivering a 2-hour YouTube video, I have difficulty sitting through anything that's 2 hours long anymore. I mean, this is interaction. This is, yeah, I just, no, I have not seen. I tried to watch Kraut's China video. I think I liked where he was heading, but I only made it 20 minutes in. I have not seen his Turkey video. That sounds fascinating. James Cook asks, will Turkey ever be kicked out of NATO? I would say almost certainly not. NATO fundamentally is about selling weapons. It's interesting. You'll notice that NATO had no problems with 70 years of coups in Turkey. limited problems, might have said something about the Gezi Park protests, where the Turkish government was, I think brutalizing probably overstates it, but was definitely repressing political stuff. Said nothing about the hundreds of journalists in jail. Said very little about the overreaction to the coup. But the second Turkey thought, mentioned that it might buy some Russian weaponry, like that's what NATO really cares about. NATO is a sort of syndicate for selling weapons. It's an arms sales marketing trick. And Turkey has the biggest military in NATO, has a growing use for munitions. No, Turkey's not getting kicked out of NATO. It was very interesting. I can't remember who it was. I think the House of Representatives passed a whole slew of anti-Turkey stuff, like recognizing the Armenian genocide and maybe trying to do sanctions or some horse shit like that. And I can't remember if the Senate ended up acting on the Armenian genocide thing and like a toothless resolution thing, but the idea of any kind of sanctions or complaining about Turkey just died in the Senate. Because if nothing else, the U.S. foreign policy, mostly because nobody in the U.S. really cares about it, has been given over to defense contractors. And there's no fucking way that those defense contractors are going to let the Turkish market slip away from them. They are enraged, and who knows, there may be heightened penalties for the S-400 thing. Who knows what's going to happen? So S-400 is a Russian missile system that Turkey decided to purchase. So, how that is going to shake out, I don't know, but I see zero chance of Turkey getting kicked out of NATO because that would make it harder for defense companies to sell weapons, U.S. defense companies to sell weapons, and British defense companies to sell weapons. So that's never fucking happening. No matter, who in Congress gets in a tizzy. Local Cool Extreme asks, can Turkey afford its empire's dream? How has it avoided recession? Turkey has not really avoided recession. That's the interesting thing. The Turkish economy has had a number of rough years. What's interesting at this point is it's not avoiding a recession. It's like, can they avoid a default? Can they avoid widespread economic catastrophe? It's a really interesting. I've done a couple videos on this, sort of Turkey's zombie economy, and did Donald Trump kill the Turkish economy? And it's this really interesting thing when somebody controls the media, the extent that Turkey does, the Turkish government does. It's like, how does that work? For a very long time, you had experts everywhere in the world being like, this ain't gonna work. This ain't gonna work. It's gonna collapse. But the Turkish economy just kept on keeping on and kept on doing really well. Kept on keeping on, kept on doing really well, and then it was actually finally derailed over evangelical pastor. When Trump started tweeting about sanctions or something like that, that sort of popped the bubble to an extent. The Turkish lira is already gone through an extraordinary devaluation. And it's a constant question whether Turkish companies and the Turkish government are going to be able to continue to service their debts. Well, at the same time, Erdogan refuses to go back to the IMF. Qatar is stepping up. I'd mentioned that earlier, sort of keeping Turkey sort of independent of the IMF. I'm not as well versed as I am with the Turkish economy as I once was when I worked in it. But it's this tremendous house of cards that's, it seems to not collapse entirely, but it ain't doing great. That's why, for a long time, the Syrian refugees were a plus for Erdogan in politics. It was only after the economy crashed, that these ideas of Muslim solidarity and defending the poor Syrians stopped being as popular because people are like, oh no, these poor Syrians are taking my fucking jobs, and there aren't any anymore. So yeah, that's a very good question, logo. Like how the heck does this keep going? Like how does the Turkish economy sustain itself and this imperial policy? It's a great question. I think answers to some degree the Qataris, but yeah, that I don't know. Who knows? Of course, at this point, economically speaking, that's how I feel about the whole world. Who knows? So, good point, Logo. Should have acknowledged that more. Brando Commando with a super chat, thank you. Asks, Greece was praising their new ambassador to Syria, and Syria reciprocated the praise. What will Turkey think of this? Cornered Erdogan is a dangerous Erdogan. I don't know that Erdogan is that cornered. Well, actually, I think that is an aspect of his position in Syria itself physically. Like that is interesting. And you're absolutely right. A cornered Erdogan did prove to be a dangerous Erdogan when, in a couple of days, I can't remember, it was a couple of months back, in a couple of days, the Turkish military like wiped out half of the Syrian government's gains over months. So yes, absolutely dangerous. But the specific, I think that Turkey is looking for ways to make its peace with Assad, honestly. And I think that's sort of the inevitable result. And that's also, I think, why the Turks are very interested in shipping as many militants as possible to Libya. Let these, deranged jihadis go die fighting Haftar, rather than turning on them when Turkey makes its inevitable peace with Assad. What's interesting is, I think Europe, I think really everybody other than the United States, and Turkey is getting on the board with the idea that, okay, Assad is going to still be around. He's got a number of years left in him, and it's time to make our peace with that. As I said, I think even Turkey is getting there too. So I don't know that Greece praising an ambassador, to Syria, I don't know that that's really necessarily such a huge problem for Turkey. I mean, if the Assad government was able to truly be welcomed back into the community of nations and welcome back into the community of nations and sanctions were lifted and Syria got serious push got serious groups of people behind the idea that, oh, Turkey invaded my territory, I need it back. That could conceivably be a problem for Turkey, but we are years or decades away from that happening. I don't see that ever happening while Assad is still in power in Syria. Just no way. And I think it seems likely to most. Though there's some interesting news articles coming out. I don't know how much of that is just wish casting from the U.S. or a dynamic that's actually happening, that Russia might be getting sick of Assad. I don't know. Yeah, so I don't see that as a problem yet. Another super chat from DKK. Wait, oh, there it is. Okay, there's a question. Should the permanent status of France and Britain's position on the UN Security Council be reconsidered? That's a good one. Honestly, yeah. I mean, sure, obviously. It's ridiculous. Ridiculous that two European countries have representation there. I think they should both be, I think maybe give Britain's to India and give France's to the EU. That would be my solution. That would be my ideal approach. And there's a certain poetry to that, because it was India's wealth that made Britain the all powerful 19th century super powerful power that it was, and then the fumes that it's been coasting on throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. So give India Britain's seat. And give France's to the EU. I think that would be great. The chances of that actually happening in my lifetime, with life extension and everything, in my lifetime, that's imaginable. In the next 5 to 10 years, it is not. So that's what I'd like. But yeah, I don't see that. I don't see that happening. Yeah. But yeah, I absolutely agree that the permanent status of France and Britain in the UN Security Council should be reconsidered. However, just to be a little more serious, to think about it a little more seriously, allocating the, I'm not sure there's a legal way to really do that. It's not like France or Britain would allow that. Maybe France would be willing to give its seat to the EU. I doubt it. Really doubt it. That's conceivable. Britain would not be willing to give up its power on the UN Security Council. So if somebody in the UN Security Council vetoes the change to the UN Security Council, how does that happen? So like it's quite possible that we could live in a very possible and actually not a very positive thing to contemplate that, you know, like 100 years from now, if like what I would like to happen is sort of like the US world system continues to evolve and become a system that everyone can benefit from, where people aren't fucking invading countries anymore and destroying them, like, you know, where everybody has a real legitimate democratic say, like sort of what the United Nations was supposed to be. If that happens, there's a distinct chance that like 100 years from now, like if, you know, everything goes well and like, you know, we manage to avoid another world war and everybody's, you know, happy and prosperous on Mars or whatever, you know, there would still be a UN Security Council, and these rinky-dink fucking European countries like France and Britain like would still have like veto power, though of course nobody would really, you know, I think their veto power would be vastly circumscribed just by the fact that they were kind of rinky-dink countries, and you know, sort of there'd be a lot of you know, it'd be like Alaska, you know, there'd be a lot of Chinese and Indian and you know, U.S. Infrastructure built in you know, French and British provinces to bribe them for votes. You know, it just wouldn't. Yeah, so I think that's a distinct possibility. It's something I hadn't really thought about much. Yeah, I think that's unfortunately going to be like the Electoral College thing in the US, where it's like just this sort of weird institutional thing that just is. Unless, you know, there's another massive world war, you know, a billion people die, and then, you know, the UN that gets set up after that won't include France and Britain. Not willing to do that. Pirate King asks, Mo Freedom Foundation, do you think a pan-Arabic or even pan-Islamic state is possible? And what potential could it have? And what about Africa and UN Security Council? Oof, yeah, that's a very good question. The Africa and UN Security Council. I think the AU should have a UN Security Council seat. Interesting that my head didn't go there automatically, and I apologize. The African Union should have a UN Security Council seat. The other question about pan-Arabic and pan-Islamic state is possible. Pan-Islamic state is not possible. I find that sort of laughable. As much as interested as I am in defending Islam from the attacks of the United States, the Chinese, the Indians, everybody as a victimized class or religion, I am not, despite the beard, I am not a Muslim. I am not somebody who is particularly sympathetic. It's not something I talk about because I don't really, in videos, because I don't think it's really my place. I'm a pretty enthusiastically agnostic fella, and while I have respect and find historical interest in, you know, all religious traditions, I'm not somebody who really thinks that they deserve a large role in government, which could possibly offend some followers there. So yeah, the idea of a pan-Islamic state and the idea that like Bosnia and Indonesia are gonna, you know, like have a unified government. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Pan-Arabic is something that I think is something that is it's sort of a dream that's just so makes so much sense, and it's just so sad to see what has happened to it. And at this point, however, I don't know that it's really viable. This idea, and even in the 1800s, it's interesting. Just did a series of videos on like Muhammad Ali and his successors in Egypt, and for a period of time, you know, Muhammad Ali took over Syria, and yes, you know, his that had a hell of a lot to do with European powers, British invasion, and whatnot. But there were also like serious problems when he with his exerting influence and power over those Syrian domains that he had taken. In 1958, Nasser's Egypt was I think it was 1958. Don't quote me on this, but Nasser's Egypt was able to join a treaty with Syria and create the United Arab Republic. Like for 2 or 3 years, that was a thing that existed. And then it fell apart because Egypt and Syria couldn't agree on how they handled things. And now, sitting here, 100 years after the establishment of these separate countries in the Middle East, it's just it's really hard to imagine how a true like pan-Arab state could be created. I think that the possibility for that did exist after World War One with Faisal. The British crushed it, though. Also, even with Faisal after World War One, who knows if it would have actually worked? Arabs are tremendously different ethnically, linguistically, from place to place. Whenever I do a video on North Africa, I've got a ton of folks being like, "We're not Arabs," and obviously, that may or may not be how most people in Algeria feel, but like, it's we're Amazigh or we're Berber, we're this, that, and the other thing. Do I think there's a realm for a more powerful North African Union or a more powerful sort of Middle East, and by Middle East I mean sort of like union, or a more powerful like union, like along the lines of like the African Union or the European Union? Absolutely. I think actually like an Arabic sort of union, like going from Morocco to Morocco down to Oman, including Sudan, I think that and up to Syria. I think that honestly, in a lot of ways, makes a lot more sense than an EU going from Greece to Ireland to Finland. I think that that's something I'd like to see. That's something that sounds very interesting. But the idea of like what Nasser was trying to build, or what's interesting is there's all these. It wasn't just Nasser, it was Gaddafi, it was Bourguiba. Man, I've made all these Tunisia videos and I don't know how to pronounce Bourguiba. Like Bourguiba, Gaddafi, Nasser, like all these folks, did preliminary treaties with other Boumediene, like with other Arab countries, to like, okay, like, how do we unify? How do we like make ourselves one bigger unit? And it just never worked. And especially after 100 years of development as independent nation states, you've got like independent histories, languages. Arabic. Yeah, I think modern standard Arabic is unified everywhere, but it's spoken in different ways everywhere. Cultures, the TV shows they watched. It's mass literacy came to these regions, and mass population came to these regions in the context of independent states. One of the things I'm most embarrassed about on this channel is like when during the height of the Islamic State thing, I did a couple of videos where it was like, it's time to split open Iraq. And as horrific an experience as Iraq has had over the past 17 years, there are tons of people who believe in a unified Iraq, because a unified independent Iraq has existed since the 20s and 30s. The last 20s and 30s. It's got a real history. It's got a real culture. It's got a real, it's a real people now. So yeah, I don't think pan-Arabic seems particularly plausible. A pan-Arabic state seems particularly plausible. There's a super chat that I'm missing. There we go. Brando Commando, the very generous Brando Commando. Thank you so much. It sounds like Russia forced Assad to get rid of their PM in order to get future economic support. The Duran, a pro-Russian YouTube channel, said Syria is becoming incredibly corrupt and Putin isn't happy. Thoughts? I think it's a little interesting to be complaining about the corruption of Syria. And it's a war zone. Like, this is what happens to war zones. Like, corrupt criminal people assert themselves, create fiefs and militias and this, that, and the other thing. the fact that all these minor interests are competing with the what used to be the overarching interest of the corruption and self-dealing of the Assad government is very interesting. So the Duran is 100%. Is 100% correct that Syria is incredibly corrupt. I haven't really thought through. I don't fully understand, honestly, why Russia and Assad are falling out at this point. I think it's possible Russia. What's very interesting is that Russia is, despite the press, Russia is nowhere near as committed to Syria as Turkey is. Turkey's got troops on the ground. Turkey has taken territory. Turkey, I mean, it's a real deal, a very real deal. But Russia has, they contributed some mercenaries. They contributed some fighter jets, the Air Force, whatever, which is, a nice money spinner for no doubt many people in Putin's clique. But man, they are nowhere near as wealthy or they feel nowhere near as wealthy as they felt 5 years ago. Jesus, yeah, was it 5 years ago? September 2015 sticks in my head. When Russia got big into Syria, and that was after the 2014 price crash. But oil price crash. Back in 2015, everybody said, "Oh yeah, it's been a bad year. Oil prices will come rampaging back. Russia's always going to have all this money to support itself." Putin's approval rating is sinking below or getting troublingly close to the 50% mark. Putin is Russia is a place with managed elections and completely co-opted media. But yet Russia wants to be fucking done with Syria. And especially that massive big offensive that they bankrolled into Idlib, that then just got sort of pushed back by the Turks quite summarily. Must have been a little frustrating and a little clarifying for Russia. And Russia desperately wants to be friendly with Turkey. Which is kind of hard to square with the fact that they are supporting a large military that kills Turks. To be clear, I've got videos on this, I don't believe a serious long-term Russian-Turkish alliance is possible. They're both too ambitious and too close. But it gives Russia more leverage in the short term if it can be friendly with Turkey. And the fact that this fucking civil war that was, meant to be a quick victory in Trali law 5 years ago for Russia is still wearing on is a serious problem. So yeah, this thing with Assad could be an attempt to get Assad to get his house in order. It could be a legitimate question on the part of Russia. Is there a better horse that we can back here? It was funny. I was thinking of doing a video, but I'm not, because I think it gets too close to being straightforwardly pro-Assad, which I am not. I do believe Assad is a mass murderer. I believe Assad is a mass murderer because the United States turned him into one. Yeah, I'm not in the mood to do stuff that could be construed as pro-Assad propaganda or trying to save Assad's position in Syria. So maybe I should for stability purposes. But the parallel that this makes me think of more than anything else is, God, and I'm going to forget his name. I'm sorry. Is it Diem? In the Vietnam War, the United States had a dictator that they supported in South Vietnam. It's Ngo Diem Diem. I can neither pronounce Vietnamese, but through the latter 50s and the early 60s, the United States supported the South Vietnamese dictator. And he was accurately seen as insanely corrupt, a disaster. And the Kennedy administration was like, you know what, God, I bet if we had somebody else running South Vietnam, everything would go great. And, things would go great. So I'm not 100% I don't think the CIA did it themselves, but they certainly sanctioned the assassination of this Diem character because there was somebody else that they believed would, be able to really do a good job in South Vietnam and, win that war. And it didn't happen. So yeah, even if he's a nasty, corrupt dictator, the great, incredible saving grace for Russia in Syria. The reason they're not in a quagmire is that they worked with, from the beginning, somebody with his own well-developed internal power networks. That's why it's been such a low-cost thing for Russia compared to Afghanistan when they went there, or when the U.S. went to Iraq or Afghanistan. Like, that's why it's been the ability to work for this gem-like figure, work through this gem-like figure, is the reason that it's been such an easy thing for Russia, such an easy, low-impact thing for Russia. So I think I think what they're probably doing is threatening Assad in the hopes that he gets his house in order better. But yeah, I think Russia would be very stupid to facilitate the overthrow of Assad. I think that would be pretty disastrous for their whole experience there. Hafiz Farouk asks, don't you think that rather than an invasion, Islamic world is undergoing a civil war where US, Russia, and China back their favorite clients? I think that's a little oversold. But like, what are the dynamics? What are the lineaments? You've got, so you're, at this point, you're saying it's sort of the Gulfies, well, I guess Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Egypt versus Turkey and the Qatar, or is it? Yeah, I don't think it's appropriate to call it a civil war. I feel like the approach saying, oh, like Islam or the Middle East is having a civil war is a way to excuse foreign interventions that do really horrible things. Like one of the during the specifically at the height of the Islamic State thing, like people were like, oh man, like is this the Middle East 30-year war between Shia and Sunni, between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Is that what we're about to see? And like, I think it was even incorporated by like some certainly thinkers and pundits, but I think even some military figures were like, this is this great 30 years war in the Middle East that we're just starting. And the really horrifying thing, so the 30 Years' War was a big religious conflict in Europe in 1618 to 1648. The really horrifying thing is I was reading a book, I think by some Israeli ambassador from maybe 10, 15 years back. And he was like, well, as we all know, the Middle East 30 Years' War started in 1979. It's like, great. So then like year 45, we're getting into year 40 of the 41 of the 30 Years' War. And what's interesting, because like, that's sort of a like, ooh, they do religious struggle. Europe had religious struggle. We talk about it. And actually that parallel is better than some of them might imagine, because yeah, it is all about the 30 Years' War was not primarily about religion. It was about dynastic power and politics. And that's exactly what the Shia Sunni stuff in, Islamic Civil War stuff is in the present day. It's just foreign powers. So I don't want to misconstrue your question, Hafiz Farouk. You're absolutely right that, yeah, it's about, favorite clients and whatnot and outside intervention, but it's less about internal dynamics than I think your question indicates. That's my take anyway. And I think that saying like, oh, these ceaseless hatreds and it's it's an area of endless conflict and blah, 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 blah. I think those are ways that, the United States, Russia, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel make excuses for what they're doing to the region. So yeah. Questions. Still Not Bitten asks, are you familiar with Serbian politics and current state, as well as Bosnia and Herzegovina? And sorry, my phone was blowing up. Are you familiar with Serbian politics and current state, as well as Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia? All very similar cases. Can you make a video on these? The Balkans. I've been to the Balkans. I've read very long books on the Balkans. Yeah, I don't have anything. It's this. I'm sorry. It's an extraordinarily important, extraordinarily valuable important historical region. But whenever I contemplate diving in on Serbia or Croatia, or it's kind of similar to one of the considerations that come up whenever I dive in on Israel Palestine. It's like, am I going to really read this many books and get this into it to make a video about 10 fucking million people? Because that's Israel and Palestine together. That's about 10 million people. Serbia is under 10 million people. Croatia is under 10 million people. Like, it's hard to get excited to do that. I would say the main thing I know about Balkan politics is I'm pissed off at the EU for drag-assing on accession talks for these countries. I completely understand the EU's fatigue with adding countries, and it makes perfect sense to me. And yeah, like, as much as I'd love to see Turkey, Ukraine, Russia in the European Union, I understand, especially considering how little has been figured out, if the EU needs to take 2 or 3 decades off and figure things the fuck out. But again, because these countries are so goddamn tiny, Croatia, Slovenia, Croatia and Slovenia are already in the European Union. To not be moving forward more quickly with Macedonian, Montenegrin, Bosnian, Herzegovinian, Serbian accession talks is infuriating to me, because it would help with everything. Even if, and also it's a really positive story for the EU at limited cost. What the EU has managed to do that's been so effing extraordinary, even before it was technically the EU, is, it helped both Spain, Portugal, and Greece transition into modern democracies from sort of petty dictatorships they were prior to. And it's also dramatically helped, less so in the past decade, obviously, 12 years, dramatically helped economic development in those countries. And Ireland is the big winner. So in these tiny countries that are quite impoverished, EU accession could allow that positive aspect of EU just, PR, soft power, politics, self-image continue for not very much money. So that it really pisses me off that the rest of the Balkans haven't been absorbed in the EU yet. That's probably everything I have to say about Balkan politics. Like, I just, like, whenever I want to dive, it's like, ooh, like, the new Serbian president or prime minister is either, very for the EU or very not. Or it's just like, it's 9 million people, man. Yeah. So, questions. Eric asks, do you think, though I doubt so, that the Kurds ever get their own state? No, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think that's likely. I mean, there's so many, if you go out decades, there's so many interesting ways to think about things. Turkey, with Erdogan, before Erdogan lost that election in 2015 and figured out that turning on the Kurds in a big way would get the nationalists on his side, there was a very serious Turkish-Kurdish peace process that was not talking about autonomy or independence, but was like, okay, like, let the Kurdish party run the towns and provinces over there. That's fine. And there was like you could really imagine like a settlement where, like, not you'd have to be very careful about the wording. You have to be very careful about fucking everything. But like, you could imagine like a quasi-independent Iraqi part, definitely not independent or autonomous, but like, kind of a little bit autonomous. Kurdish part of Turkey, and a similar thing in Syria in the context of what was developing in Turkey in the Middle East in 2010, where like Turkey was trying to construct that like free market area between everybody. Like, you could have really imagined that. And in coming decades, maybe you could really see that, where you've got like meaningful self-government. In Turkey, even today, it's been an extraordinary. The Kurds have seen extraordinary progress compared to the 90s, you know? But like nothing is possible. Like this whole fucking model of like, oh, we're going to destroy Iraq and Syria and then, just sort of throw the dice and hope an independent Syria, Syrian or Iraqi Kurdistan emerges. Like that's just not, I don't think that's viable. I don't think that's something that's not a good model. I think what you need is peace, prosperity, and then, allowing Kurdish nationality to exist. And then who knows? Like all kinds of positive things can develop from there. Like as irritating as like the Catalan situation in Spain is right now, like that's still like pretty awesome and like something that like should be aspired to by Kurds. Like that's like a real possibility. Like an independent Kurdistan is not something that I'm interested in at this point. Nor do I think it's practicable. See, questions. Oh, well, I've answered your question, still not bidden. Herod King, follow-up question. Don't you think a replica of the EU would be disastrous? Just like what's happening in the EU now. I recommend you a piece by Omavar Anjum, Who Wants the Caliphate? That does sound interesting. I think the EU made a disastrous move, which was the unified currency. To be willing to do a unified currency without being, without a real unified central bank was an incredible fuck up. I think the EU itself has been amazing. I think that absolutely like an Arab or MENA union or a African union, like even especially if they've got sort of overlapping jurisdictions, I think it is a fantastic way to organize the world. Like what the EU did pretty much up until the euro and many things after the euro currency is fantastic. Added to European power in the world, added to peace and prosperity, like made it possible for, Europe to go I guess went from 1945 until 2014, but before, without an interstate war. Yeah, EU is a good thing. Putting together regional blocks isn't just a good thing. I think it's very important. I talk a lot about how fucking stupid Brexit is for Britain, like trying to be an independent country, they're making themselves a world power, with 60 million people. Well, how does that make any more sense with, Syria with what, like 20 million, or Iraq with what, 40 million, or yeah, no, I think it's a no-brainer. Obviously, you shouldn't. Europe has been kind enough to illustrate that you fucking shouldn't do a attempt a unified currency without having countries that are on the same page and a whole range of other things. Noted, lesson learned. There's still an amazing, common market, free movement, just incredibly beneficial aspects of the European Union that could be adopted to a greater extent in the African Union, in between Arab states. James Cook asks, how much of Europe's opium goes through Turkey? I have no idea. I think Turkey's got pretty draconian law. I recall from that film, Midnight Express, I've never watched. Turkey has some pretty draconian anti-drug laws. And generally among pretty drug-happy expats, the common complaint was it was very hard to find there. Logo Cool Extreme asks, how is Trump administration completely incapable of capitalizing on coronavirus, unlike Cuomo, who has arguably messed up just as bad? That's a fantastic question. Like, it is. Yeah, the fact that fucking Cuomo is, loved right now is just a clear indication that all you have to do in a crisis is seem sane. Trump has not done that. It's interesting, even among, folks I know who are, were big Trump supporters. It's just like, they're just like, what the fuck? And no, don't get me wrong, like Trump's base is going to remain Trump's base, but like, I think that, yeah, I do not think he's going to be around. So yeah, basically the Trump administration is completely incapable of capitalizing on coronavirus because they don't have any people who are capable of governing. They've been firing them. I mean, initially there were a number of people. I mean, from the get-go, a lot of the people who were appointed in the Trump administration were garbage. But there were some people who were competent, knew how to run a government, this, that, and the other thing. They're all gone. It's just sort of the Trump's Twitter feed and extensions of his Twitter feed. It really is amazing. Like I was talking to, there are folks who, argue like, oh, I think we might have overdone the lockdown in the United States and this damn media and those liberal governors, yada, yada. And it's like, okay, yeah, maybe you've got a case there. Maybe that's right. Like maybe the whole country didn't need to do what New York had to do. Okay, make that argument. But the reason that we were able to run away with this solution was because the president wasn't proposing one. For 3 years, Donald Trump illustrated that you can have a fairly happy, competent, U.S. economy and functioning country without a president. Now we needed a president. We didn't get one. Tiwate asks, why do people have a problem with the Electoral College but not the Senate? Would love an American's perspective. The Electoral College, people do have a problem with the Senate. I certainly don't. But I think the reason the Electoral College is such a thing is because it means that the popular vote doesn't matter, which doesn't exactly. You can make an argument that the Senate does the same thing, but it's more attenuated. It's easier to ignore the way that functions. Just as it's easier to ignore the Congress generally. Most Americans don't know the name of their senator or congressperson. But every American, 95% of Americans know who is president. And in the 20th and 21st century, one of the bad developments in the United States has been the accretion of more powers with the president. And in the popular imagination, like popular awareness, the president has become a bigger deal. That's very much a bad thing. So that's why the Electoral College is more important to people in the Senate. I've been meaning, for years, I've been meaning to write a series of videos on why actually the way that the Senate is apportioned is a great thing, but I keep not doing it. I should put that on my board. Stuff to do. I've got a big involved system of whiteboards now. You can see that Yemen's coming up. Yeah. All right. Questions. Why Fatel, I really got to figure out how to pronounce your name properly, asks, why is the U.S. allowing fourth-tier powers like France and Britain so much influence? The question is, in what context? Like in the UN Security Council? Like, because, and in a lot of ways, under functioning presidencies, like France and Britain are just sort of extensions of ourselves used to be in most meaningful foreign policy things. Like right now, they're fighting with Trump very hard to maintain an agreement that the last U.S. president got them into with Iran. So yeah, I don't think it's really that we're allowing France and Britain so much influence. It's just like, oh, these countries function as useful appendages for us, and that's a much smarter way to run a world than telling everybody how powerful you are and running around putting them down and telling them how stupid and weak they are. That's the way Trump does things, and obviously it's not very effective. Like it was interesting in the direct aftermath of World War II, there was a very real anti-colonial instinct in the United States. I think it's arguable that U.S. pressure had a lot to do with the British giving up India. But that was in the very short term. Then, really, by the late 40s, it became very clear that there was going to be this tremendous conflict between the Soviets and the United States. The Cold War started to develop. And what's, I think, quite shameful and quite sad is that the United States sort of did a quick turnabout and decided that what was left of the French and British empires should be preserved and bankrolled to an extent. The U.S. involvement in Vietnam really only started building up under Kennedy, but it was present throughout the Eisenhower years because when famously the French were kicked out of Indochina, Vietnam, the French called Vietnam Indochina. The French were kicked out of there in 1954 in the aftermath of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. I'm not sure exactly when. I think it was in the late 40s that fight started. By the end of the French, the Vietnamese War of Independence from France, by the end of it, in the mid 50s, the early to mid 50s, the United States was bankrolling all of it. So the United States is interested in preserving French and British power because when the United States is not doing something that's all fired fucking idiotic, like invading Iraq under Bush or everything Trump has done, France and Britain are usually pretty eager to act in the U.S. interest. That was especially true. Well, actually, no, de Gaulle was very interested in asserting his independence from the United States during the Cold War. I think it might even have dropped out of NATO for a bit. But more broadly, during the Cold War, the U.S. and Britain, generally pretty aligned with the United States, and I think that's also the case in the post-Cold War era. And if the United States had fucking sane leadership again, I think is more likely to be the case going forward, as China has unfortunately turned itself and allowed itself to be turned into more and more of a pariah or a perceived threat. So I don't think it's the U.S. allowing French and British pretensions to power. I think it's the French and British pretensions to power actively help the United States, or at least do when our presidents aren't idiots. Brando Commando has another super chat. Thank you so much. Very grateful for your generosity here. I thought France and the UK led the coalition against Libya. And once it was clear they couldn't continue the operation because they didn't have the military capabilities, they asked the US to step in. I think that trajectory, I think that gets at a very real truth, but I think that trajectory is kind of off. I think it was always clear that the US was going to be doing the brunt of it. I actually have a buddy who was in the military and flew some of the missions that went in the night before to clear out all the anti-air stuff so the British and French could send their planes in to bomb things. So yeah, the whole leading from behind thing, which for some reason was a club that was, Obama was beaten with, like, at no point do I believe, so I guess at that point, back then it was Sarkozy, right? That Sarkozy and wasn't still Brown. Hammer? At that point, I don't think it was really credible at any point that Britain and France were going to do it by themselves. And I think to the extent that Obama was led into that by France and Britain, he made a terrible mistake. I think that was just sort of part of because Bush had left such a terrible taste in everybody's mouths with his, like, fuck all y'all, I'm invading Iraq anyway. I think Obama and the US sort of very consciously was like, okay, let's let these other folks take the lead on this to sort of flatter them again. That's important. I think the US wanted to take out Libya, though, wanted to take out Gaddafi anyway, though. It's forgotten now, but back in the 80s, before Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi was the big, nasty bad guy. He was the horror show. He was the new Hitler. He's the guy who must not be appeased. And there are plenty of people back in 2011, still today, who still saw the world in those senses and felt like, ooh, we're getting revenge for Lockerbie or something, which has obviously had horrific consequences. Pirate King asks, don't you think Tunisia's political system of hyper-fragmented power is a threat to democracy? And what's your take on Mahboubani's book, Has China Won? I don't know Mahboubani's book, Has China Won. Why would Tunisia's hyper-fragmented power a threat to its democracy? I've read a couple of Tunisia books. I'm not entirely sure what you're getting at. I mean, you mean the fact that Tunisia is actually trying to do a democracy? I think that's pretty great. I should support it. I think it only appears to not be doing so great because there's a fucking war next door. It's one of the great tragedies of Tunisian democracy is that before 2011, when they had a dictatorship, they were cited between two very happy, very wealthy petrostates that really enjoyed Tunisia. And the sort of relatively freer air of Tunisia, and Tunisia profited mightily. Now Tunisia has a democracy. Libya is a chaos-failed state, and Algeria is dealing with the fact that oil prices are half what they were, what they had been expected to be. So yeah, I'm sort of mystified by that Tunisia question. Maybe you could clarify. Tony Gohagen, thank you, asks, what say you about a third party? Thank you for the super chat, Tony Gohagen. What say you about third party for the USA? I founded this YouTube channel to advocate for third parties in the United States, actually. I wrote a book you can find on Amazon called Throw Away Your Vote, Why Voting Third Party is the Only Thing to Do. I still sell it, but I don't promote it at all. And you can go back to early 2016. I was all excited to use my YouTube channel to promote the Libertarian and Green Party candidates. That's why I started this. But then Donald Trump got nominated by the Republicans, and that ended. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of third parties. I think, unfortunately, the way that the U.S. system is set up is the way that third parties function, not to actually take power, but to advance new ideas. Like that's actually how our system has changed. Sort of Ross Perot's platform back in the 90s was absorbed by both by the Republicans and the Democrats. So that's why I was excited about third party. I just don't have a lot of faith that we can have with our current structures, like the kind of European style legislature that seems like folks might be advocating for. I don't know. Maybe it's possible. I founded a YouTube channel to advocate for third parties. Obviously, I'm a little disappointed, and who knows? Like, in the 2024 election, if it's a couple boring ass sad sacks, then maybe I'll be advocating for meaningful third parties again. But in this current environment, all the most important thing to me personally is getting rid of Donald Trump. Just for the peace and sanity of the world. James Cook asks, will Tarkan be Turkey's next president? That's a pop star, right? I mean, fuck, I don't know, man. I'm not as up on Turkish politics as I should be, but I did read a recent policy, and that seems unlikely. Did I miss a super chat from Brando Commando? Nope, I got the thought France and UK led the coalition against Libya. Got that one. Let's see. Questions. Braffian Blackfire asks, how do you think the Libyan civil war will change as a result of the coronavirus? Will more economic pressure on KSA and UAE limit their ability to support Haftar? Yes. I think that's a huge factor. I think that's, as I discussed earlier in the video, like Turkey has had some pretty extraordinary success in rolling back Haftar's attempt to take the rest of Libya. And the fact that not just KSA and UAE, not just the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but also Russia are all big Haftar backers. And all of a sudden, they were already operating in a period of declined oil prices and declined oil prices and whatnot. But obviously, coronavirus tanked prices even more. So that means less money for everything in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Russia, and certainly less money for foreign venturing. Also, Haftar's not doing himself any favors. I mean, he's just he very clearly wants to set himself up as an old-style strongman. The crazy thing about like Haftar is like he had a falling out with Gaddafi in the 80s, but I believe he helped support. The Gaddafi's initial taking of power. He was like one of Gaddafi's boys. Haftar's in his late 70s. He's a old-fashioned 20th century strongman, and I think everybody's getting sick of that sort of approach to things. Mark Multi, do you have an eye on the EU? Euro area news? Shit is wild right now. Yeah, man, shit is wild right now, and I do need to get back into that a little more. Like the German court was basically like, oh, the European Central Bank can't do the stimulus it's doing. I mean, I finally read an article on that, and it's apparently not quite that like strict, but yeah, it's just nuts. Like this is the EU has managed. Funny, back in 2014, after a bunch of nationalist parties did really well in the European Parliament elections, I wrote a video being like, don't worry about it. This is fine, man. You got to understand, since the financial crisis, this is just a reaction, you know? Like the EU's had a really bad, 5 years. Like at the next European elections, this sort of nationalist moment will be over. And then, of course, U.S.-sponsored jihadis took over enough parts of Syria to launch the migration apocalypse. And then Brexit happened. And then coronavirus happened. And it's like, fuck. Like, I went from being like very confident in the EU's continued survival to be like, I don't know how it keeps going. So no, I haven't like drilled down. But like, yeah, coronavirus is providing another crisis for the EU where it's like, what are we? We have the same currency, but like our central banks, our central banks try to work together through the European Central Bank. And then the German High Court tells us we can't. Like, what the fuck is going on? So I don't know. Like, and if enough people are just sort of like whenever the nationalists come to power in the country, they're like, actually, we kind of like the EU. So like if they can just finally sort out, and I don't know what the answer is, like sort out like how the euro and central banking and finance actually works, then maybe the EU can sort of muddle through. But yeah, I haven't been following the EU news. That I actually made sort of a conscious decision. Like I'm going to be doing a lot of Trump, obviously, in the summer and fall. But I'm trying to avoid it for now. And I'm just like, I want to like make some videos about Egypt. I'm going to do some Yemen because it's been too long. But like, and then I'm going to, I want to like really dig in on the Sudan, like, am I supposed to call it the Sudan or just Sudan? Like even stuff like that. Like that's what I want to do for like a little while. And then of course I'll have to, dive in on the election. So, okay, I think we are coming in on 2 hours. We've just dipped below 100 viewers. So I think that's probably a good sign okay, one last question from Logo Cool Extreme. Is China creating its own anti-China coalition on its own thanks to... Yes. Well, that was an easy one to answer. Logo Cool Extreme asks, is China creating its own anti-China coalition on its own thanks to coronavirus? Absolutely. And I think that's... another reason why the U.S. seeing enemies everywhere is a bit nuts is just like the enemies we choose are just so shoot themselves in the foot, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that our enemies have much less power, and they have to act in more brutal and stupid ways to compete with the almost the absurd power and privilege that the United States has. Okay, well, I got another super chat, so I am answering another question from Brando Commando. Long term, thank you, Brando Commando. You've been very generous as ever. Long-term power dynamics look to be shifting towards Southeast Asia. I think India's problems are more solvable than China's, even though it's a very poor country and will rise above China. What's your thoughts? I think India's problems are more solvable than China's, even though it's a well. The main thing that India has that China doesn't is demographics. India remains a young country. I believe that India will be able to continue. Um, the big question with China right now is it gonna get old before it gets rich? And I think India has a much longer runway with that. Just the way demographics are working, they didn't have a one-child policy, what have you. So I think India has tremendous potential. However, the gap that is built between India and China is so massive. I think just what 20 years ago, China had China was a poorer country, maybe 30 or 40 years ago. China was a poorer country than India per capita, what have you. And now it's in a completely different realm. India, I think for many bad reasons, but also some good reasons, just doesn't have the ability to, or has yet to figure out how to engage in the level of hyper growth that China did. But it's got the runway to do that, and it's got the English language skills, which is important. It's got tech skills. It's got a powerful and wealthy diaspora in the United States that's willing to work with it to make good things happen. I think there's so many reasons to be optimistic about India, but there are so many obstacles. So I would say, I think what Brando Commander says there, that India's problems are more solvable than China's, I think that's a really interesting premise. Not sure I 100% agree with it. I think it's very plausible. For sure, it's very plausible, but I'm not 100% convinced by it yet. I have not done the necessary reading on India and Pakistan. Like I've read a lot of books about the British Empire in India, but as far as like modern India, like it's a whole world that I just don't have yet to begin to understand. And I'm eager to begin to understand. Well, we're back over 100 viewers, and we've got another super chat. So I guess we're going to keep going. Pandemonium Never says, what do you think of China's current relationship with Taiwan? That's a very interesting one. I made a Taiwan video called Arguing with Myself about Taiwan a while ago, and I think I was going to do a video in reaction to this whole coronavirus thing where I was like, actually, now I'm like not as torn anymore. I'm more pro-Taiwan. I'm like, what can we do to defend Taiwan? But I'm not sure I'm 100% there yet, so I'm not going to run that. What I think I am going to run is like sort of comparing Taiwan to like two regions that existed during the British Empire, and like how there's some interesting parallels between how that works geopolitically. But anyway, that's something that will be coming up. China's current relationship with Taiwan is freaking weird because like Taiwan's a huge investor in China and has had a lot to do with China's incredible rise, which is yet at the same time, Taiwan has a government that China, I'm not sure like when the more China friendly or the less like pro-independence Taiwanese party is in power in Taiwan, is China more like, does China ever acknowledge the Taiwanese government, or like are informal contacts better? So Taiwan now, what Taiwan has done now is that it has what Taiwan has done now is that it has both made itself look incredibly successful with this coronavirus thing. And I believe the current president is from the party that is more pro-independence. And, both of those things are likely to make China irritated, annoyed, threatened. So, yeah, that is not improving the current relationship with Taiwan. I think that the way that both China and the United States are abusing the World Health Organization right now is just so goddamn frustrating. It's an organization that should be focused on, actually defeating this disease worldwide, not fucking dick waving over the Taiwanese. And I think actually the United States could stand to do less focusing on Taiwan at this point. I do feel like China has failed with the coronavirus, as the United States has failed dramatically with the coronavirus. But you know, the disease was certainly probably spread much more than China by the United States, but the disease did not come from China. And those sort of initial 2 or 3 weeks when China was hiding the development of this disease really did do the world an extraordinary disservice. And I think while I'm not quite ready to start sort of advocating and talking about, ooh, how can the United States defend Taiwan better from China? I don't think I'm there yet. Um, I am to the point where I think you have to acknowledge that this crisis is going to put Taiwan in a better stead. And I think that as the world community looks to ways to, for lack of a better word, punish China for this, I think relationships with Taiwan are going to be the way to do it. Pandemonium Niebuhr, you keep me going here with another super chat. How has India's relationship with both Sri Lanka and Myanmar been affected since the BJP took over and now COVID-19? Pandemonium Niebuhr, I have no idea. That is a fantastic question. I think that would be really, really fascinating to know more about. The BJP, for those of you who don't know, is the party of Narendra Modi, who is now the second term prime minister, right? God, I didn't get that wrong. Is now the second term prime minister of India. And Modi, despite selling himself as like the pro-business guy who was going to make India rich finally guy, he's got a really grim nationalist past. And that is what the BJP is. It is, I'm not even going to try. The BJP is, Modi is not the first BJP guy to become prime minister. I think they first took power in the 90s, and then it switched back to Congress, the sort of old-fashioned establishment party. But the BJP party, different figures try to distance themselves from this to different degrees or not at all. But BJP is sort of the Hindu nationalist party, and that creates problems with a lot of people. There's, I believe, 170 million Muslims in India. So yeah, obviously the Hindu Nationalist Party is not going to be great for them. The degree to which Modi is responsible for it is deeply controversial, but it is indisputed that there was essentially a pogrom against Muslims in, I think it was the Gujarat was the province that he was the governor of back in 2000 or so. So Modi is a very creepily nationalist figure who has not been as successful with the Indian economy as everybody hoped and as he sold himself. There's actually information coming out saying that that maybe not just him, but maybe prior governments as well, I'm not sure on that, it could just be him, might have actually been fudging India's economic figures, which has incredible ramifications for everybody, you know, from Amazon's business case to get involved in India in a big way to the whole oil industry that was expecting India to do more of a China thing and is now maybe not be. So as India's government, Modi's second-term prime minister has been shown to be less successful economically, it's meant that he's leaned more heavily on being nationalist and being specifically a Hindu nationalist, someone who believes that the Indian identity should be limited to Hindus, not including folks who disagree with this, you know, strongly Hindu nationalist approach. So that would obviously create problems with other countries in the arena who have their own sectarian profiles. Myanmar has been in the process of, some say, genociding a Muslim minority out of the Rakhine province. The Rohingya have been pushed into Bangladesh. A key part of Modi's sort of Indian Hindu nationalist horseshit has been trying to strip Indian citizenship from people that he believes should be going back to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a Muslim country that has taken most of the Rohingya. I'm not sure if there's Rohingya overflowing into India or not, but the idea that Modi's sort of anti-Muslim visions of Indian citizenship and wanting to send a couple million people who've been living in India for 50 years back to Bangladesh is obviously going to exacerbate these problems. So, man, I don't know. That's a fantastic question, Pandemonium Neighbor, and is also illustrating how much I do not know about India, specifically Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and their relationships, which is embarrassing. But thank you, Pandemonium Neighbor. Oh my gosh, Pandemonium Neighbor, you're going to turn this into a 2.5 hour thing, which, if you're going to keep doing super chats, I'm not going to say no. How are China's and India's different stances conflict with their collaboration in the Belt and Road Initiative and BRICS alliance? That's interesting. So the Belt and Road Initiative and BRICS are sort of very different things. The BRICS is a fascinating concept. I guess we don't hear about it so much anymore, but some investor, some analyst, was he in London or Singapore or New York, came up with this sort of handy acronym saying the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These countries are going to be the new coming developing countries. And I think this is 10, 15 years ago now. This was the coming thing. And what was interesting, I think maybe some funds were established to invest in the BRICS, the BRIC countries. South Africa, some people just say it's the BRIC, BRAIC, and then S is South Africa. There's another one, the Mint, Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. That was another one people were trying to do. But what's interesting is I think at some points, the BRIC countries actually did have like some kind of symmetry or something like that. But I don't think that particular international organization apparatus still has much to speak for it. I don't think does that have much institutional weight yet? I'm not aware of it, nor do I think it's particularly likely. The Belt and Road Initiative is interesting and very big and very Chinese. It is not particularly collaborative. It is collaborative in the sense that it is bilateral. It is a relationship between China and the country in which it is building infrastructure, and sometimes loaning a lot of money to build that infrastructure. The Belt and Road Initiative, or what's the other one? What's the other? One Belt, One Road. There's another acronym you see. What's interesting about it is I think it's a little oversold in terms of its broader strategic significance. Like, great, you're building a train between Xinjiang and Hungary. Like, not sure why anybody would take that or want to send freight on it when they can just send it through the Suez Canal for less of the price. It's interesting, and I like the idea of sort of infrastructure. A big fan of it. However, there is one very key place where I do believe the Belt and Road thing is very significant, very interesting, and gets directly to Pandemonium Niebuhr's question, which is Pakistan. By far, I think to the tune of $30 billion or maybe $60 billion at least so far, Pakistan is by far the greatest recipient of funds from the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you look at a map, you can see why. China is quite rightly, as the United States keeps rubbing in, very concerned about the South China Sea, Japanese, U.S. Power in the South China Sea, very concerned about the idea that, their outlet, even in that massively long coastline, could be bottled up. So it's very strategically significant and important for China to have access outside of that, to be able to have access to Europe and the United States. Well, I suppose to access the United States, they just go across the Pacific, but like that isn't easy to bottle up in the Straits of Malacca. So it is what they're doing in Pakistan is they are attempting, and I think there's some indication it might be blowing up in their face. Pakistan is already having trouble with some of the debt. I could very easily see the sort of fervently, somewhat very strongly conservatively Islamic people of Pakistan deciding all of a sudden to start caring about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and making things very hard for the Chinese there. But they are building, I think is there a railroad, roads. They're building an outlet. They're definitely building a port, a couple ports in Pakistan to give them another way out, sort of a back way out. That is tremendously significant. And obviously, considering the long period of negativity and violence between India and Pakistan, the fact that China is surrounding India in a kind of way, because China and India have had, I think, recently have had border disputes. I think in the 60s, 70s, or 80s, there was an actual low-scale war between China and India over the border, and I think there was a sort of military facing off against each other back in the last year, over the past couple of years. There was like serious tensions at the border between India and China, and it was, I think, definitely during the Modi administration, and to have China and Pakistan becoming closer, getting together like that, was, I think, tremendously is a real problem for India. So that's going to be very interesting seeing how that shakes out. As always, like how Pakistan shakes out, and Jesus, that country. I don't understand much. The more I read, the less I understand. Okay, I think finally 2 hours and 15 minutes. No more super chats, guys. I think we're probably here. Ali Karim asks a question for you. Have you read the book Wealth of Nations, exploring the relationship between IQ and economic? Oh God, no, I have not read that. Oh God, I was about to compliment Ali Karim. I was like, oh my gosh, look at this guy. He's read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. I always have so much admiration for people who can actually really go read like the tomes that Enlightenment, folks back in the 1700s that sort of provided the underpinning of the way that we see the world. Like, I'm always really impressed when people can go back and read that. That's not what Ali Karim did. He has some book on IQ and economic prosperity he wants me to read, which I'm not interested in. So anyway, I can read Edward Gibbon. That's fantastic. Decline and Fall in the Roman Empire. Anyway, I am, I think, reaching into, I am reaching the end of coherence after 2 hours and 10 minutes of talking. I'm tremendously grateful, as ever, to all of you for being here and participating so eagerly. Tremendously grateful. There is no more Freedom Foundation without you folks. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Patreons. Thank you to incredibly generous super chats. Next week, next Friday, I'm going to do this again, but for patrons only. I'm sorry to do that to folks because I hear, because I know like a lot of people don't have U.S. credit cards or whatever. It's not just U.S. credit cards, but like I need to find a way to make this channel more sustainable. And I think providing some Patreon only content might help with that. Brando Commando and Pandemonium Niebuhr, please reach out to me on Twitter at RobOLaw, or send me an email. I mean, you guys are incredibly generous. I will obviously send you the link to the patron only thing. But so yeah, next Friday I'm going to do patron only content. I think it's going to be kind of like a news brief thing. I'll just like go through the news stories for the month from like countries that I focus on, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, what have you. That's going to be patrons only. If you sign up for just $1 a video, you'll get access to that next Friday. I'm kind of bummed about doing patron only live chat because I love like being able to talk to 100 people, and I think with that I'll probably be talking about 5 to 10 people. That's a thing that is on offer. My name is Robert Morris. I tweet at RobOLaw. I am on Instagram at The Golden Age. I have written a number of essays or books. I've taken to calling this one a short book, the Everybody's Lying About Islam. I think it talks about the U.S.-Saudi relationship, very worth buying, available on Amazon, paperback and Kindle form. We've got this, Fatka and the Birth of a New American Empire, which is, man, I read this and I'm like, wow, I used to know a lot of stuff when I was an attorney. But this is, I think, still very valuable and has a lot worth teaching. There are another couple essays for sale on Amazon. I don't really advertise them as much or offer them as hardcovers because they're more for completists. They're kind of old and out of date. I still believe most of what I say in them. But and then there's this. This is my book, Avoiding the British Empire, which it's really amazing. Thanks to coronavirus, more and more people are actually reading this whole thing, and I'm getting like a couple emails a week because a lot of people bought this. But now I'm getting a couple emails like, wow, I finally finished your book, because a lot of people have a lot more time. And people who finish this are like, wow, like this, it's like why the world is the way it is. It's kind of a history of the world. So yeah, everyone who's finished it has really liked it. It is a bit dense. When I rewrite this in 5 years' time, as I expect to, I'll try to make it a little more snappy, but yeah, you can get this in paperback or on the Kindle. Sadly, all through Amazon. I should probably sort out a better way to do that and do audiobooks, but working on it. Yeah, I think that is what I've got for today. Thank you once again, all of you, for being here. 85 of you have stuck through not only that whole talk, but this whole, past 3 minutes of spiel and pitching. And yeah, thank you guys. You guys make this whole thing possible, and I am very grateful. So yeah, I'm gonna end the stream there. End.